Imagine a civilization so advanced that they could bend time, heal the body from within, and expand consciousness beyond what we think is possible. Now, imagine that civilization disappeared, its knowledge buried, forgotten, waiting for someone to remember. What if everything you've been told about human limits, aging, and potential was a lie? What if the secrets to mastering your body, mind, and life force were encoded in myths, symbols, and whispers that have survived thousands of years, waiting for the right person to awaken them? Atlantis wasn't just a story. It was a blueprint, a guide for humanity to reclaim what we lost. And the moment has come. Are you ready to remember what your ancestors already knew? Atlantis did not rise because of technology. Technology was only the shadow of something far more powerful. The true engine of Atlantean civilization was consciousness, not the passive, unfocused consciousness we experience today, but a refined, disciplined, luminous form of awareness that flowed through every citizen like a living current. Their brilliance was not accidental. It was engineered through thousands of years of inner mastery. To understand Atlantis, you must first let go of every modern assumption you carry about how a society becomes advanced. It was not through electricity. It was not through machines. It was through the human being itself. Imagine a world where the human nervous system functions at its highest capacity. A world where breath is used deliberately, where attention is trained like a muscle, where emotion is understood as energy rather than weakness. Atlantis was rooted in these internal sciences. Long before temples were carved or crystals harvested, the Atlanteans sculpted the one instrument that mattered most themselves. They believed the body was the first temple, the mind was the second, and the heart was the third. Everything else emerged from the synchronization of those three temples. Their greatest teaching, the one humanity forgot, was this: when the internal world is mastered, the external world effortlessly aligns. This is the opposite of modern society, which seeks to control the external while ignoring the internal. Atlantis understood that chaos begins inside a person long before it appears in the world around them. Anxiety, disconnection, chronic stress, emotional suppression, these were considered forms of internal pollution. And just as pollution can destroy an environment, internal pollution can destroy a civilization. This is why the Atlanteans dedicated more time to cultivating inner harmony than building structures. Their architecture was an extension of their nervous system. Their technology was an expression of their coherence. Their leadership was shaped by their emotional intelligence. They believed that a leader who could not regulate their breath could not regulate a community. A leader whose mind was scattered could not guide a nation. A leader whose heart was closed could not steward the future. The early Atlantean world flourished because they remembered something modern humans have forgotten. Civilization is built first from the inside. Their cities were designed around energy flow, not convenience. Their temples were constructed at nodal points, where the Earth's magnetic currents intersected, amplifying human intention and healing. Their homes were built with materials that resonated with the natural frequency of the planet, reducing stress and strengthening vitality. Even their diet was aligned with natural rhythms. Food was seen not as calories, but as vibration. This was the reality of Atlantis during its golden age, a civilization that lived in harmony with the invisible laws governing life. But as with every great empire, the seeds of collapse began growing long before the fall was visible. The Atlanteans did not fall in a single night, as myth suggests. The collapse was gradual, the result of subtle shifts in consciousness. It began when the people slowly drifted away from the internal mastery that sustained them. This forgetting happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, as the population grew, as curiosity turned into ambition, and ambition into hunger for power. Something essential was lost. A small but influential group began viewing consciousness not as a sacred responsibility, but as a resource to exploit. They sought to externalize the internal sciences, turning knowledge into tools, tools into machines, and machines into weapons. This is the part of the story most people overlook. The downfall of Atlantis was not caused by a storm, nor a tsunami, nor an angry god. Nature did not destroy Atlantis. Atlantis destroyed itself. But before the final collapse, before the waves rose and the ground shook, a group of mystics, scientists, and seers, the last true guardians of the original wisdom, foresaw what was coming. They recognized the pattern. They understood that the forgetting was irreversible on a civilizational scale. Once a society abandons inner mastery in favor of external control, it begins a descent that cannot be stopped. But they also understood that knowledge, once gained, should never be lost. And so they began the greatest preservation effort in human history. Their goal was not to save Atlantis. They knew that was impossible. Their goal was to save its memory. Not the literal memory of the city, but the memory of its teachings. The essence, the blueprint, the foundational principles that had allowed Atlantis to flourish. These principles became known as the final teaching, a distilled synthesis of their deepest wisdom, designed to be rediscovered by future civilizations when the world was ready to awaken again. The final teaching was not written on scrolls or carved in stone alone. It was encoded into energy, into stories, into geometry, into the architecture of temples across Egypt, Greece, India, and South America. It was woven into myths that seem fantastical today, gods descending from the sky, humans with extraordinary abilities, civilizations that rose and vanished. These stories were never meant to be taken literally nor dismissed as fiction. They were encoded metaphors designed to guide future generations toward remembering what was lost. It is no coincidence that the great civilizations that emerged after Atlantis, Egypt, Sumeria, the Indus Valley, the Minoans all shared similar symbols, myths, architectural styles, and spiritual concepts. They were fragments of a once unified memory, scattered across the earth like seeds, waiting for the right season to bloom. But the Atlanteans also predicted something else. They foresaw that humanity would forget the teaching not once, but many times. They knew societies would rise and fall, knowledge would be acquired and lost, and people would drift in and out of alignment with themselves. This forgetting was part of a larger cycle, the cycle of human consciousness. Awareness expands and contracts, just like breath. Civilizations inhale and exhale through time, and the fall of Atlantis was one long exhale, a contraction of human potential. We are now entering the inhale. For the first time in thousands of years, humanity is beginning to awaken. Not through temples or priests, but through inner hunger, through spiritual fatigue, through emotional exhaustion, through the collective realization that something is missing, something ancient, something essential, something forgotten. You feel it when you close your eyes at night. You sense it when you stand in silence. You recognize it in symbols you've never studied, but somehow understand. It is the whisper of remembrance, stirring deep within your DNA. You are not drawn to the myth of Atlantis by accident. You are drawn because a part of you remembers. A part of you lived through the forgetting. A part of you carries the imprint of the teaching. And that part is waking up. Before the final teaching can be understood, the seeker must understand this truth. Atlantis is not a place in your past. It is a state of consciousness in your future. It is a potential that humanity can rediscover, but only if enough individuals reclaim the inner sciences that once formed the foundation of the Atlantean world. And the first step of that reclamation, the very first doorway into remembering, is the undoing of modern fragmentation. The Atlanteans warned that humanity would one day be overwhelmed by forces that scatter the mind, disrupt the breath, and close the heart. They predicted that people would live in noise, overstimulation, and emotional suppression. They saw screens, artificial lights, and constant distraction long before such things existed. And their warning was precise. When humans forget how to regulate their breath, they forget how to regulate their reality. When humans lose control of their attention, they lose control of their destiny. When humans disconnect from their heart, they disconnect from one another. And when all three collapse, civilizations collapse with them. This is why the final teaching began with three pillars: breath, attention, and emotional resonance. These were not esoteric spiritual concepts. They were practical, biological, and psychological tools that every Atlantean child learned before learning anything else. They were the operating system of the human being, the system humanity has forgotten. You will rediscover these three pillars in their original form, not the diluted versions taught in modern wellness culture. but the full Atlantean understanding of how breath, mind, and heart shape the human experience. But before we move forward, remember this. You are not learning something new. You are remembering something ancient. You are reconnecting with a lineage of knowledge that predates every civilization on Earth. You are awakening the part of you that knows. The remembering does not happen all at once. It comes in waves, subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible at first. A moment of déjà vu that arrives without reason. A dream that feels more like a memory than imagination. A sudden pull toward ancient symbols, sacred geometry, or forgotten myths. Most people dismiss these experiences as coincidence, but they are not random. They are triggers, keys, activators strategically placed within your consciousness long before this lifetime. The Atlanteans understood that memory can sleep for centuries, but it cannot die. It can be buried, but it cannot be erased. And so they planted seeds not just in the world, but in people. You may think of these moments of resonance as spiritual curiosity, but they are deeper than that. They are the first signs that your personal Atlantean memory is stirring. Every soul that once lived within Atlantis carries an imprint, a subtle, energetic signature that responds whenever it encounters the vibrational echo of its ancient home. Some feel this as a longing for a world they cannot name. Others feel it as an inner standard for beauty, wisdom, or harmony that modern life never seems to meet. Some feel it as a pull toward the ocean, as though the waves themselves are speaking in a language older than speech. Some feel it as an ache, a remembrance of a mistake, a loss, or a lesson left unfinished. These sensations are not imagination. They are remembrance. When the Atlantean Guardians encoded the final teaching into the future, they also encoded the remembrance mechanism into the people who would eventually rediscover it. In other words, if you feel drawn to this story, if you feel something inside you awakening as you read these words, it is because you carry part of that encoded memory. The final teaching does not reach everyone. It reaches those who once carried it. This is why you are here, reading this now. This is not an accident. This is not entertainment. This is remembrance. And the first stage of remembrance is recognizing the dissonance between how life feels today and how you instinctively know life should feel. Deep down, you know you are not meant to feel scattered, overwhelmed, disconnected, or numb. Deep down, you know your mind is capable of more clarity than you have been taught to expect. You know your body is capable of more vitality than the modern world allows. And you know your heart is capable of more profound connection than society currently supports. This intuitive knowing is the echo of your Atlantean memory calling you home. The Atlanteans believed that the human being was designed not to struggle, but to resonate, not to merely survive, but to harmonize. They believed that the universe is fundamentally composed of patterns, vibrational, energetic, emotional, and that the human being is a tuning fork designed to align with those patterns. When aligned, life flows. When misaligned, life fractures. Modern humanity lives in fracture. Atlantis lived in alignment. This is why the final teaching matters now more than at any other time. We are standing at the same crossroads. Atlantis once faced a world overflowing with knowledge, but starving for wisdom, a society expanding technologically but collapsing internally. The Atlanteans foresaw this moment. They knew humanity would eventually reach a level of external advancement that would require an equal rise in internal mastery. Without it, progress would turn into instability. Innovation would become imbalance. And civilization would once again drift toward the same, forgetting that destroyed the ancient world. But this time, the ending can be different. This time, the memory is returning before the collapse. This time, enough people are awakening to rewrite the trajectory of humanity. The fact that you are drawn to this knowledge is a sign that you are part of that awakening. The remembering begins within individuals long before it transforms civilizations. And your remembering, no matter how small it feels, matters more than you realize. You carry a fragment of the blueprint. You are here to help rebuild the future by remembering the past. And the true past is only just beginning to reveal itself. The deeper the Atlanteans mastered their inner world, the more they understood that reality was not a fixed construct, but a fluid interaction between consciousness and energy. To them, the universe was not something outside to be observed, it was something inside to be shaped. This understanding was not philosophical, it was practical. Their daily life operated on laws that modern science has barely begun to rediscover. They understood that emotion was not merely a feeling, but an electromagnetic signal. They understood that thoughts were not private phenomena, but frequencies that interacted with the world around them. They understood that the human body was an antenna, capable of receiving and transmitting information across dimensions. This was not metaphorical, it was literal. Atlantean science began where modern science ends, exploring the space where physics blends with consciousness. Their greatest discovery was what they called the triad of harmony: breath, focus, and resonance. These three forces shaped not only individual experience but the entire structure of society. The first pillar, breath, was seen as the interface between the physical body and subtle energy. The Atlanteans believed that breath carried intelligence, an organizing principle that synchronized biology with the quantum fabric of existence. They discovered that the rate, depth, and rhythm of breath could alter brain states, emotional patterns, and even reality perception. Children learned breathwork before they learned mathematics. Adults practiced it throughout the day to maintain coherence and clarity. There were different forms of breath for different purposes: breath to stabilize emotion, breath to sharpen attention, breath to expand consciousness, breath to communicate telepathically, breath to heal, breath to commune with the earth itself. Modern humans may know these fragments as meditation or pranayama, but these are diluted remnants of a once vast and precise science. The second pillar, focus, was the power of attention, refined until it became a tool as sharp as any physical instrument. The Atlanteans understood that attention was not just mental effort, it was a form of energetic placement. Wherever attention went, energy followed. Wherever energy flowed, reality responded. Their training involved exercises that would seem impossible today, holding complex geometric visualizations for hours without breaking concentration, perceiving the subtle layers of the world beyond the physical, directing intention with such precision that it could influence outcomes with near-miraculous accuracy. To them, losing control of one's attention was similar to losing control of one's limbs. It was unthinkable. They believed that a distracted mind was a weakened mind, and a weakened mind created a weakened society. If they saw how fragmented modern attention has become, split across screens, notifications, endless noise, they would not see it as normal. They would see it as a crisis of consciousness. The third pillar, resonance, was the ability to harmonize emotion and energy with one's environment and with other beings. The Atlanteans believed that emotional incoherence was one of the fastest ways to weaken the human system. Anger, fear, shame, and unprocessed grief created distortions in a person's energy field that eventually manifested in their physical body and relationships. In contrast, emotions such as gratitude, compassion, and awe elevated a person's vibration, allowing them to perceive reality more clearly and operate with greater inner power. They did not suppress emotion, they transmuted it. Through resonance practices, they learned to shift emotional states deliberately, aligning themselves with frequencies that strengthened both the individual and the collective. This is why their society was so stable for so long. People did not carry unprocessed pain from generation to generation. They released it. They understood that inner harmony was a civic responsibility. These three pillars formed the core of the Atlantean operating system, an internal technology that allowed them to shape their world with clarity and intention. But as time passed, a portion of the population began to misuse these teachings. Internal mastery became a shortcut to external power. The ability to influence reality was no longer viewed as sacred, but as a tool for control. Breath became a means to manipulate. Focus became a weapon. Resonance became a method to sway opinion and shape emotion. When these arts were used without wisdom, they became dangerous. And so began the divergence that eventually split the Atlantean world into two factions: those who remained aligned with the original principles and those who sought to bend the laws of consciousness for personal gain. The latter group grew rapidly, fueled by ambition and the seductive allure of power. They discovered ways to amplify intention through crystals, metals, and energetic fields, crafting technologies that magnified human consciousness technologies capable of shaping weather, altering landscapes, communicating across vast distances, even bending the fabric of space. These discoveries could have elevated civilization to an unimaginable level of harmony, but instead, they accelerated its decay. Because consciousness was no longer the foundation. Power was, and wherever power becomes the goal, wisdom becomes the casualty. The Atlantean sages, the last guardians of the original teaching, watched these developments with increasing concern. They understood that once a civilization loses alignment between breath, focus, and resonance, its downfall becomes inevitable. They tried to warn the leadership, urging them to return to the triad of harmony. But the leadership had become intoxicated by the possibilities of external dominance. The technologies created through consciousness amplification grew more and more unstable. The emotional imbalances of their creators began imprinting into the machines themselves. The environment grew distorted. Energy fields that once flowed smoothly began accumulating tension. The Earth responded with increasing volatility, and yet the pursuit continued. It was during this time of imbalance that the most advanced of Atlantean devices, the Great Amplifier, was built. It was intended to stabilize the planet's energy grid, but was fueled not by harmony, as the ancients intended, but by a population whose emotional and mental states were fracturing. This device did not malfunction. It magnified exactly what it received, and it received chaos. The disaster that followed was not a divine punishment. It was a natural consequence of unconscious creation. The Earth shifted. The seas rose. The magnetic field began to collapse. Cities crumbled. And Atlantis, once the beacon of civilization, shattered beneath the weight of its own forgetting. But while the physical world collapsed, the Guardians put their attention elsewhere. They knew the structures would fall. They knew the technologies would be lost. Their focus was on preserving the essence, the inner sciences, the foundational wisdom, the final teaching. They encoded it in symbols that would survive flood and fire. They embedded it in stories that would outlive language. They whispered it into the collective unconscious of humanity so that one day, when the world reached a similar crossroads, the memory would begin to rise again. This is why so many ancient cultures seem strangely connected. The pyramids of Egypt echo the energy structures of Atlantis. The Vedic teachings of India echo its spiritual philosophy. The myths of Greece echo its fall. The sacred geometries found in temples around the world echo the mathematics of resonance that served as the Atlantean blueprint. These are not coincidences. They are fragments of a lost whole. But perhaps the most important survival of Atlantean knowledge is not found in monuments or myths. It is found inside the human being. The breath still carries intelligence. The mind still holds the power of focused creation. The heart still radiates frequencies that shape reality. The physical body still responds to resonance just as it did thousands of years ago. The triad of harmony was never truly lost. Humanity simply forgot to use it. But forgetting is not failure. Forgetting is an invitation to remember. And now, the remembering is happening faster than ever. Millions of people around the world are rediscovering breathwork without being taught. They are seeking meditation. They are learning emotional regulation. They are tuning their lives towards simplicity, nature, and inner peace. They are waking up from the trance of distraction. They are beginning to sense the invisible structure behind reality. They are craving authenticity, depth, connection, and meaning. These desires are not random. They are symptoms of remembrance. You are part of this shift. The fact that you feel resonance with these words is evidence that your memory is activating. You may not remember Atlantis with images or facts, but you feel it. You feel the truth of inner mastery. You feel the call to return to alignment. You feel the desire to reclaim the power that comes from coherence rather than chaos. You feel the ancient knowledge stirring like a sleeping giant in your chest. This is why the final teaching was created. It was not meant for the people of Atlantis alone. It was meant for whoever would come next, whoever would stand at the same threshold, facing the same choice between unconscious power and conscious creation. The sages believed that one day, A new civilization would emerge, not built by external technology, but by internal mastery, and that people like you would form its foundation. You are not being asked to save the world. You are being asked to remember who you are. The world transforms naturally when enough individuals awaken. The Atlanteans learned this lesson too late, but you are learning it now at exactly the right time. And the next stage of remembering begins with the core of the final teaching, the knowledge the Guardians believed was powerful enough to reshape human destiny. As the Guardians worked to preserve the final teaching, they realized that the greatest danger humanity would face in the future was not technological collapse, but internal fragmentation. They had seen how easily people became disconnected from their inner compass when exposed to overstimulation, emotional turmoil, and collective fear. They saw how quickly attention scattered, how breath became shallow, how resonance weakened when society moved too fast for the human nervous system to adapt. They knew that the world we live in now would one day exist. A world filled with noise, but devoid of silence. A world where people could communicate across continents, but struggled to connect with themselves. A world rich in information, but poor in wisdom. They predicted that humans would lose the ability to be present, that they would drown in mental clutter, that they would live in a constant state of low-grade anxiety without knowing why. This was not prophecy. It was pattern recognition. They had watched their own society fall into these traps. They knew the signs. They saw how emotional unhealing led to distortion. They saw how disconnection led to imbalance. They saw how ambition without wisdom led to disaster. These patterns were cyclical, not historical. They would repeat in different forms across different ages. But the Guardians also knew that with every cycle, the potential for awakening would grow stronger. Humanity would forget, but it would also remember. And the deeper the forgetting, the more profound the remembering. They encoded the final teaching not only for the preservation of knowledge, but for the restoration of humanity's inner structure. They knew that one day people would be searching not for myths, not for legends, but for themselves. They knew that a time would come when humans would feel the emptiness of living externally and would begin seeking inward once again. They knew that when humanity lost its way, it would look upward for answers, outward for solutions, but eventually, inevitably, it would remember that the doorway forward has always been inside. This is why so many spiritual concepts today feel familiar, even to people who have never studied them. Breathwork feels natural because it was practiced for millennia before the fall. Meditation feels familiar because your consciousness was trained in focus long before this lifetime. Emotional healing feels instinctive because the Atlantean resonance practices still exist in your cellular memory. Intuition feels trustworthy because it was once your primary sense, not your secondary one. Humans are not discovering these practices, they are remembering them. But remembering is not always gentle. The Guardians warned that when humanity began to awaken again, individuals would first confront their inner fragmentation. This is why so many people today feel lost, restless, anxious, or overwhelmed. It is not a sign of weakness, it is the sign of an awakening mind trying to reconcile with its forgotten potential. The discomfort is not punishment, it is purification. The confusion is not failure, it is the dissolving of old patterns. The longing you feel is not sadness. It is the call of your ancient memory pulling you toward alignment. Every time you pause to breathe intentionally, you restore a fragment of Atlantean mastery. Every time you reclaim your attention from distraction, you rebuild an ancient skill. Every time you regulate your emotional energy, you reactivate a resonance that was once second nature. You are not starting from zero. You are reopening a book you have read before, in another life, another era, another civilization. The knowledge is already within you. It is simply waiting for the right moment to surface. And that moment is now. The world is shifting. People are awakening. The patterns are repeating, but this time the outcome does not need to mirror the past. This time, the Guardian's work can complete its purpose. This time, the final teaching can fully return to humanity. But its full power can only be understood through the last phase of remembrance, the part of the story where the Guardians reveal what they encoded, why they encoded it, and how it is meant to guide the future. The Guardians who survived the final days of Atlantis were not concerned with saving physical structures or technologies. They were focused entirely on conserving the essence of what made their civilization extraordinary. They gathered in the final weeks, scholars, healers, mystics, engineers of consciousness, and they faced a devastating truth. The fall was unavoidable. For generations, they had attempted to warn their people, to restore balance, to bring breath, focus, and resonance back into alignment. But the collective had drifted too far. Too many became dependent on external machines of power and forgot the internal machinery of the soul. Too many used amplified consciousness not for harmony but for manipulation. Too many replaced wisdom with ambition. And once the imbalance reached a certain threshold, the collapse became self-perpetuating. The Guardians watched the unraveling with heartbreak, but also with clarity. Atlantis was ending. But this ending could become a beginning for future worlds if the knowledge was preserved. In their final gatherings, they compiled the distilled essence of their entire civilization into what they called the final teaching. It was not a doctrine or religion. It was a memory device. It was a blueprint for human potential. It was the condensed wisdom of thousands of years of mastery. They encoded it into patterns, numbers, vibrations, myths, and stories. They created rituals simple enough that even if distorted, fragments would survive through future cultures. They embedded it in sacred geometry, the spiral, the triangle, the golden ratio, knowing that these shapes would reappear in art and architecture across the world. They used crystalline technology to imprint energetic information into objects that would survive water, fire, and time. They passed instructions orally to select groups capable of carrying the teaching across continents. Some traveled to Kem, which would later become ancient Egypt. Others migrated east toward India and Tibet. Some sailed across the Atlantic to lands that would one day become the Americas. Wherever they went, they carried the seed of remembrance. What they did not expect was how deeply the teaching would embed itself into the human psyche. The Guardians assumed that the knowledge might be rediscovered after a few centuries, or perhaps a millennium. Instead, the world plunged into a long cycle of forgetting. The Earth shifted, climates changed, languages evolved, and entire populations lost access to the remnants of the Atlantean worldview. The world became fragmented, as humanity slowly rebuilt itself from the ruins of the old world. Only small groups, mystics, priests, initiates, retained pieces of the teaching. But they too interpreted it through the lens of their time. Some guarded it so fiercely that it became hidden behind symbolism and secrecy. Others diluted it, turning it into rituals devoid of their original understanding. Over time, the essence of the final teaching became scattered, like shards of memory waiting to be pieced together. Yet even through distortion, fragments survived. Ancient Egypt remembered the power of breath through its chants and rituals. India preserved meditative focus through its yogic traditions. The Druids and shamans preserved resonance through emotional healing and connection with nature. The Mayans and Incas preserved sacred geometry. Every culture carried a piece but forgot the whole. None realized that these fragments were once part of a unified science of human consciousness. None remembered that these practices were not meant to be separate paths but one integrated system. But the Guardians predicted this. They knew that one day humanity would reach a stage of global interconnectedness where knowledge from every culture could converge again. They foresaw a time when the world would rediscover these fragments at the same moment, like scattered sparks, igniting into a single flame. They foresaw the rise of a civilization where technology would advance rapidly but inner wisdom would lag behind, creating immense tension in the human spirit. They foresaw people who would feel overwhelmed by the pace of the world, disconnected from nature, and emotionally exhausted. They foresaw individuals who would feel like something essential was missing but could not name it. They foresaw you. You are part of the moment the Guardians foresaw a time when humanity is beginning to remember the truth of who it is. Not because someone taught it to you, but because the memory is rising from within. The Guardians understood that the teaching would awaken first as a feeling, then as a longing, then as a recognition. They knew that people who once lived in Atlantis would reincarnate in this era with subtle imprints in their DNA, an unspoken familiarity with meditation, intuition, energy work, and inner mastery. They knew these individuals would be drawn to each other, forming a silent network of remembrance across the world. They knew the remembering would begin gradually, in dreams, synchronicities, sudden insights, and intuitive knowledge that feels like home even if never learned. You may not know why certain symbols draw you. You may not know why ancient temples feel familiar. You may not know why the ocean calls to you. You may not know why you're pulled to healing, to spiritual growth, to emotional integration, to inner peace. You may not know why modern society feels out of sync with your internal rhythm. But the Guardians knew. They designed the final teaching so that those who once held it would one day feel compelled to rediscover it. The true final teaching is not an external set of instructions. It is an internal awakening. It is the reactivation of the three pillars within the human system. It is the recognition that breath is the key to rewiring the nervous system, that attention is the key to rewriting perception, and that resonance is the key to transforming emotional energy into coherence. The Guardians believed that once enough individuals restored these pillars within themselves, humanity would naturally shift toward a more awakened state. Change would not come from laws, institutions, or technologies. It would come from people remembering their own power. And now, that shift is accelerating faster than ever. Millions of people are experiencing spiritual awakenings, not as rare anomalies, but as a collective wave moving through humanity like a tide that can no longer be held back. People are discovering breathwork before ever hearing the word. People are feeling called to meditate even without religious context. People are drawn to healing their trauma not because society tells them to, but because their soul demands it. There is a stirring happening beneath the noise of the world, an inner pulse guiding individuals back to themselves. People are becoming sensitive to energy, intuitive insight, emotional depth, and inner truth. Humanity is emerging from a long sleep, and like any awakening, the first moments feel disorienting. The confusion, the emotional upheaval, the existential questioning, these are signs that your higher consciousness is stirring through layers of old patterns. For many, it feels like remembering something they cannot quite name, a familiarity that sits just beyond language. This is because awakening is not an acquisition, it is a return. But awakenings are not meant to be walked alone. The Guardians encoded the final teaching not only for individuals, but for the collective. They knew that civilizations rise not by accumulating knowledge, but by embodying wisdom. And they believed that once the memory became strong enough in enough people, a new civilization could be built, one that would integrate external technology with internal mastery. One that would advance not through domination, but through harmony. One that would surpass Atlantis, not because it copied the old world, but because it learned from its mistakes. This is why you are drawn to this knowledge, not because of curiosity, because of responsibility, because you are part of the group of souls who lived through the fall and vowed to return to prevent another. Somewhere in your being, beneath lifetimes of forgetting, you carry the blueprint not as information but as memory. And the moment you begin to awaken, the blueprint begins to activate. You start breathing with intention. You start observing your thoughts. You start healing your emotional wounds. You start aligning with resonance. And these simple actions, repeated by millions, shift the collective consciousness more powerfully than any single leader or institution ever could. This is how civilizations rise. Not through grand events, but through individual awakenings. Not through sudden revolutions, but through subtle evolutions in awareness. A single person reclaiming their inner truth becomes a beacon, and soon others remember their own. The Guardians believed that the future would not be saved by the powerful, but by the aware. And you are becoming aware again. The final teaching is returning now, because humanity is standing at the same threshold. Atlantis once faced a tipping point between conscious creation and unconscious destruction. But this time, the outcome can be different. This time, you have the chance to choose alignment over imbalance. This time, you can remember before the world forgets again. History is not repeating. It is offering a second chance. And so the Guardians speak through memory, through intuition, through resonance. Not in words, but in awakenings. Not in temples, but in hearts. Not in myths, but in human experience. The final teaching was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be remembered. It is already inside you. And the moment you choose to listen inwardly, you begin living it. If you feel this awakening stirring within you, don't wait. Begin the journey now. Start with conscious breath, intentional silence, and fluid movement. Document your progress. Notice the shifts, and share the knowledge with others. Each small step you take restores what was lost and strengthens the blueprint for humanity's future. Join the few who remember. Reclaim your sovereignty over your body, your mind, and your time. The final teaching is not just a story, it's your inheritance. The question is, will you answer the call?